Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Jeff Short, and today we're going to be reviewing and talking about the contents of a book that's been out now, I think, 7 or 8 years. It's Peter Hitchens' book. Let me grab it here. It's called Rage Against God. Rage Against God. And it is from the brother of the late Christopher Hitchens, who was a famous atheist, if you can recall, who died about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And this book is an attempt to respond to his brother, Christopher Hitchens, and his atheism. Peter Hitchens became a Christian later on in his life. And this book was printed, I think, around 2012 or so. And it's an attempt to explain how he became a Christian, Peter Hitchens, even though he was an atheist. He wasn't as virulent as his brother Christopher, but he held many of the same views. And in this book, it talks about why the argument that atheists often use against comparing their beliefs with the former Soviet Union, why that argument by atheists to try to get out of that comparison is bogus, and why the Soviet Union is a good example of what happens when you have an atheistic state established, and what will be the consequences of a godless, perfectly godless, totally godless society. And I wanted to talk about that because we went by the anniversary of the 1917 revolution, the Russian Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, that removed the Tsar and removed the last vestiges of the old empire, and then ushered in the new communist era, where you had so-called scientific atheism established as the controlling power in the Soviet Union. And not only just Russia, but also was an expansionistic philosophy and political ideology that sought to make the entire world atheistic. And so I wanted to talk about that Russian experiment that thankfully died around 1990. And thankfully that we're not cursed with that form of atheism anymore as a state-established power. And we can actually take time to reflect on what that actually was, what that experiment actually meant, and how we never ever want to fall into that darkness again. And I say the word darkness because Peter Hitchens, as a journalist, lived in the Soviet Union for a couple years and did reporting from Moscow and other parts. And he was there before the fall of communism in the U.S.S.R. And he knows what it's like to live in this communistic, atheistic government, under that government. And he testifies to the darkness and the depression and the weight and the oppression that is there everywhere because of this imposed atheism. So let's think back, for example, what was attempted in 1917 when the Bolsheviks came into power, and then gradually Lenin came into power. And what was that regime trying to do by imposing atheism on the entire nation, and then also beyond the borders of Russia, all over Eastern Europe, Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all of these Eastern European nations had this United Socialist Republic imposed on them, the atheistic ideology of Lenin, Stalin, and so forth. What were these revolutionaries trying to accomplish? Well, to understand what they were trying to do, you have to go back 100 and some years to the French Revolution. The French Revolution is just a historical note in many people's mind today. They don't really understand what the French Revolution was. But you have to understand, after our revolution here in the United States, the American Revolution, which was not in any way based on atheism, anti-religion, anti-Christian, no. It was a totally different rebellion than the French Revolution. But after the American Revolution, France and some of the philosophers and politicians decided that France needed a revolution itself. And so it set up, and circumstances sparked a revolution in France. But what this revolution was trying to do by its leaders is become a secular state. They were trying to set up and remove Christian values and Christian traditions from the country because they saw Christian values in the church and the Bible and Christian morality. That was an opposition to what they were trying to do. That was a conservative force that held back change. And so they were trying to eliminate the Christian faith and churches and Christian influences of society. So they actually took over the Roman Catholic Cathedral of Notre Dame. And at one point, they set up a fake secular religion, and they had this phony goddess of reason, and there was this whole play performed by these actors and actresses that would attempt to establish and set up some kind of a ceremony that would take the place of the Christian church ceremony. The revolutionaries tried to change the calendar away from the traditional Judeo-Christian 7-day-a-week rest on Sunday cycle, and they tried to impose a totally man-made so-called enlightened calendar. And most of their ideas, their entire idea about this whole political setup was an enlightenment idea where we don't need God anymore, we don't need religion anymore, we don't need the church anymore, we have reason, we have science, and we're going to build our government and society on science and reason and rationality, and do away with anything that can't be proven or anything that can't be reasoned to. We're going to do away with anything, which would exclude the church, the Bible, Christianity, belief in God, and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of the leaders didn't actually come right out and deny that God existed, although some did. But many of them were deists, which basically is God made everything and then left, and he's gone. We have no idea where he is or what he's doing now. He's just left us on our own. So we have to build a society based on human ideas, not any so-called revelation. Okay, that's the French Revolution. That failed. That ended in violent, bloody anarchy, where people were going to the guillotine, and there were executions and murders, mass murders, and so forth. Just a bloody mess. And finally, out of that mess, the Napoleonic Wars came, and then after that, something a little bit more stable. So that's the French Revolution. Now, the Bolsheviks and Lenin and the organizers of the Russian Revolution, they read about the French Revolution and they took the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who had read about the French Revolution, and said, hey, we need another revolution, only this time we're going to base it on the so-called scientific materialism, or the dialectic materialism that Karl Marx and Engels had written about in their works on communism. And so Lenin took Marx's ideas, radical atheistic ideas about how to build a society based on a classless vision where you eliminate God, you eliminate all religion, you build totally on science and reason and rationality. And when you do that, you're going to then usher in this ideal, perfect society that will come about, because you won't have these old traditions, old superstitions, and so on and so forth that religion brings into the mix. And you're going to have a society based purely on reason, logic, science, and you won't have to worry about, superstition and all of the different things like that. And so this was what the Russian Revolution was attempting. They were attempting to basically make it centered on man's ideas and man's experiments and man's science, and nothing to do with religion. And so what they did was, because Russia was a highly religious society, the Russian Orthodox Church was a very powerful force in Russia. And so you couldn't just go in there and basically just say, okay, we're going to take over and we're going to destroy all religion and all churches and all Bibles, and it's illegal to believe in God. It's illegal to read from the Bible. They couldn't do that all at once. So they began a systematic program to eliminate all religion in Russia and all of the Soviet states. That's what they did. And the reason they were doing that was because they saw religion as a disease. It's a sickness. It either needed to be cured or eliminated. And so once you got rid of a religion and all these competing superstitions, they call them myths, lies, falsehoods, once you began to get rid of all those, then you could have a real prosperous, beautiful society. And that is what the Soviet Union was based on, that vision. And if you want a quick way and understanding of how this vision actually looks in it from a contemporary voice, just think of John Lennon's song, Imagine. This song is the most communist song in the whole world. This song is the most atheistic, godless, utopian vision of what the Soviet Union was trying to do in 1917 and for the next 70 years or so. This song embodies everything that Lenin and the early revolutionaries were trying to do in Russia. Imagine there's no heaven, imagine there's no religion, no heaven above us, no hell below us. Imagine all the people living in harmony. It's just a glorified communist theme song. That's what John Lennon wrote. But it actually echoes in many ways what Vladimir Lenin actually envisioned in his mind about Russia. So here was this government set up through revolution, through violent revolution, totally 100% human-centered, man-centered society. This had never been attempted before. Even the French revolutionary radicals did not come right out and say, we want 100% godless, 100% atheistic government, even though many of them were atheists or agnostic and didn't like the church. They didn't actually come right out and say, we're going to establish a militant, anti-religious, atheistic state. But here, Vladimir Lenin and some of the other leaders set up from the beginning the vision. Okay, we're going to do something that has never been done before. We're going to build a society on man and his fulfilling reason and science and logic, and we're going to create a totally humanistic society. And we're going to try to eliminate all opposition to the man-made, man-centered society. We're going to try to eliminate all religious opposition, all spiritual opposition, all Judeo-Christian morality. We're going to try to implement a fully humanistic, atheistic, unbelieving, godless society. And we think that that will be ushering in a new world when this is accomplished. That was their vision. They really believed it. And so they went about their task with a ruthless efficiency. They closed down like 95% or even higher of all churches in Russia. And they made it an outlaw. It was a prohibition against educating your children. If you had children, you could not teach your children about Christianity. Can you imagine that? So they burned the Bibles, they tore down churches or converted them into atheistic museums or storehouses, warehouses. They just tried to basically eliminate all Christianity within the Soviet Union. And Peter Hitchens, in this book, basically outlines that whole process, and he talks about when he was there at the very tail end of the Soviet Union. He saw that in the schools they were teaching the children that there is no God. There were actually poems written that would teach the children. They had to memorize that there is no God, and they had propaganda posters up all over the Soviet Union and all over the different countries that would lampoon and mock old women going to church. It was the idea was it was just the old women and old witches. They would often equate these women who believed in God and Jesus Christ going to church as witches, and they couldn't be trusted. Don't let your children under the influence of the old witches and so forth. Just propaganda nonstop, 24/7. And it was a reality. And there was not freedom. You were not free to believe what you wanted. You were not free to read what you wanted. You could not make up your own mind, because if you think about it, if you think of Christianity as a disease or a sickness, and you think the people that have this disease or this sickness can't cure themselves, they need help, they need intervention, then you're going to treat them as if they're children. And so you're going to take away their freedoms because they're too sick to know they're sick. And so the state has to come in and impose the cure. And if the person that they're trying to treat, literally sometimes, oftentimes, they would actually take these people who were Christians to re-education camps to try to break them and break their faith down and break their belief system down and brainwash them to the point where they're not professing Christianity anymore, or they'd make them renounce their faith, or they'd ship them off to camps. Alexander Solzhenitsyn outlines the Gulag Archipelago, where these labor camps would basically be your death warrant. You'd have to go out there and work in the cold winter and die out there of starvation or simply of some disease. And that was what they would do to Christian believers or the leaders of the Christian movement in the Soviet Union. So they felt perfectly justified in attacking religion because they saw it as a disease. And so they needed to be like the doctor toward a cancer. He goes into the body, and the doctor can't be blamed for cutting out a cancerous polyp because he's trying to help the patient. Well, that's the same way these leaders, these atheists, felt that they could cut out the religious portions of society to help cure the society as a whole. So they would do this without any moral standards. That's another thing. There was nothing that was too excessive in pursuit of their goal, which is to stamp out all religion, because they saw it as a disease. They saw Christianity as a disease, a mental illness, something to be cured, if not cured, killed or removed, so it wouldn't spread. And so what would happen was Christianity was persecuted, opposed. The pastors were thrown in jail, priests were killed, Christian believers were separated from their family, mocked, marginalized. You couldn't get a good job unless you were affiliated with the Communist Party. If you were known to be a Christian believer, you could not rise in society. You couldn't get a better job, better pay. You were destined to poverty. Your home could be invaded at any hour of the night. If you had a prayer meeting, it could be busted up by some thugs from the government. Christians were killed. They were imprisoned. Churches were burned down, closed. Children were brainwashed. They were told to report on their parents if their parents were doing something religious in the home, and so forth. And they were also forced to join the atheistic youth groups where they would mock religion. And then they would also, some of these youth groups quite often would go through town, these processions, and make fake Christian processions through town, mocking and making fun of and laughing at Christian beliefs. And so all this was done in the name of enlightenment, because they felt that they were actually doing humanity a favor by freeing them from this disease of religion. And they would tell the children that heaven isn't real and God is a fairy tale, and they would just totally shatter all these children with this cold, hard philosophy of atheism. Well, what Peter Hitchens found is that Russia was a really dismal place because of that imposed atheism. And the thing about atheism is that if you really, and we see this today with, for example, Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins says that if you raise your child in a Christian family and encourage them to be Christians, that's a form of child abuse. Now you can see the connection between what Richard Dawkins is saying and what Lenin and the atheistic revolutionaries in Russia were saying. Dawkins is saying it should be against the law to raise your child a Christian because that's a form of child abuse. That same rationale was used back in Soviet Russia to do all kinds of evils and to destroy churches and ship off Christians to worker camps and actually kill people, execute them, under the guise of we're really curing society's illness. We're curing the disease of religion. And this all springs from the Enlightenment idea that we have to start from man. We have to start from our own brain and work out. And we can come up with our solutions without God. We don't need God because God is a primitive idea that needs to be replaced now with science. And that's what is scary about this philosophy of atheism, because you see it now in our Western world, in the leading scientists, the leading science institutions, the educational system, the academia, the leading intellectuals, and now even more in the government, under especially the so-called progressives, the radical left. When they get in power, they secularize almost everything they can. And there is a definite hostility even to religion in the extent that religion has influence. So the leftists today in our country are perfectly willing for Christians to have their church as long as they keep their religion within the confines of their church. But they don't want any of the values of Christianity and the teachings of Christianity out in the public. And that's why, for example, there's an effort in the secular media right now and in a lot of institutions in our society to stamp out Christian beliefs in public. And so you can't talk about marriage as one man, one woman, because the Bible says that, Adam and Eve established in the Garden of Eden. You can't bring that into the argument because they say, oh, well, that's just your religion. As if that's just a fairy tale. That's just a nonsense. We have to think about this from a purely human standpoint, is what they want to say. Well, we already know what happens when a society rejects God in that way. And what happens is that it goes the way of the Soviet Union. And it goes the way of simply saying, hey, we're doing society a favor by secularizing it. We're eliminating the disease or the superstition or the myths or the lies that the ancient people have passed on to us. Now it's time to grow up. And that's what we see in our secular age today. And we have to, as Christians, stand up and say, no, we don't want to go the route of the Soviet Union. We don't want to see a totally secularized society. That leads to ruin. That leads to darkness. That leads to depression. That is a dead-end street. And so Peter Hitchens' books is full of a lot of good ideas to think about as far as warning society. Look, if you want to go the secular route, we've already been there before. We have the Soviet Union. We don't want to go that route. God is good. The Bible is a blessing. Christianity, as flawed as it is still a blessed and good force in society. Let's work to improve the Christian faith and improve the churches and strengthen the good that they're doing rather than tearing them down, destroying them so some godless, man-made philosophy can be put in its place. No, that's a dead-end street. So I do recommend the book. You could pick it up anywhere. The Rage Against God by Peter Hitchens, brother of Christopher Hitchens. And so that's it for today. We'll see you back next week at another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.